can talk about religious things. I know this is a public school, but you can talk about religious things. You can talk about the Lord. You can talk about anything you want. I said, okay. So I prayed about it. Lord, what do you want me to talk about at this National Honor Society meeting? And the answer didn't come right away, but eventually a young man came to mind. His name was Travis. I met Travis in St. Mary's Hospital emergency room. He was a graduating senior at the time, and he came from a very well-to-do family in East Grand Rapids. I think both of his parents were lawyers. And at the time of his graduation, both of them were going to be out of the country. They were going to be in Europe traveling. And so he took it upon himself to throw his own party. And he had a beautiful home in East Grand Rapids with a pool in the backyard, an in-ground pool. And so he invited many of his friends for that graduation party, ordered a keg for people to drink, and there were some drugs involved at that party and so on. It was a beautiful summer evening about this time of year when that party took place. And somewhere along the course of that night, Travis was showing off to some of the girls that were there and got on the diving board, having drank quite a bit, and dove down into his pool and boom, hit the bottom of the pool with the crown of his head. And suddenly, his whole body went limp. Suddenly, he was on his back on the bottom of the pool, staring up at the lights, 6 feet of water between him and air, and unable to move any part of his body. And at first, his friends, who were on the side of the pool, thought he was just goofing around. Eventually, they realized he was in trouble. So one of them dove down and grabbed a hold of him and pulled him up just in time before he sucked in 2 lungs full of water and drowned. They brought him to the side of the pool, coughing, pulled him out of the pool, and called immediately 911. They came after him and took him down to St. Mary's. About that time, I got the call. I was serving as the overnight chaplain at St. Mary's that night, and the beeper went off, and when I called the number, it said, "This is the emergency room. It's a young man named Travis coming in, paralyzed from the neck down, and can you come down and meet the ambulance and talk to him and make arrangements with his family and talk to the family?" So I did. I went down. And when I got down to see Travis, he was white as a sheet, still in his dripping bathing suit, and laid out on a gurney and not able to move at all. He was scared out of his mind, obviously thinking about a life of paralysis, thinking about how his life was going to change, all because of this one sudden impact, this one moment in time. Wondering what was next. And during the course of the next couple hours, doctors were coming in, and they were taking tongue depressors and raking the bottom of his feet to see if there was any kind of response. And there was not. The first half hour they tried nothing. Second half hour they tried raking and tickling his feet, nothing. And after an hour and a half, Travis and I had been talking continuously during all that time, and he was telling me just how afraid he was. And finally, after about an hour and a half, the doctor came in and went through the procedure and took the tongue depressor and raked the bottom of his foot, and just his big toe moved like that. Just that much. And the doctor called me aside and said, we can't get his hopes up at this point, but that is an encouraging sign. Well, to make a long story short, over the course of the next hours, days, and weeks, eventually feeling came back into his body. He still had to go through a process of therapy because there was damage to the spinal cord. But eventually, he was able to get back on his feet again. He was able to walk again. He was able to function normally again. He had his life back again. The point, that moment changed his life forever. That moment changed the way he looked at the world, humbled him, took away his cockiness, his attitude towards life. It was a moment that he would never forget. He was terrified. That feeling of invincibility, youth, that feeling that he would live forever and nothing would ever endanger his life, was instantly taken away. He was changed completely. He was softened in his heart. He was matured in a way. He began to see life. I contacted him later, and he began to see life in a different way. He appreciated life more. He began to live more in the moment without taking things for granted. He changed immensely and incredibly because of this crisis point in his life. He changed. His mom changed. His dad changed. His friends changed. His classmates changed. Even his church changed. He began to live life to the fullest, intentionally. And he began to thank God and to be grateful for the body that he had one time taken for granted. He was a handsome kid. And it also made him more sympathetic to people around him, more aware of people around him that were going through struggles, that weren't as fortunate as he was, weren't as blessed, didn't have as much, were hurting. He began to notice those kind of people. Here's all I want to say about all of this. God was in that incident. And I'm not going to get into the theological details of how God was in that incident. But I want you to know, God was in that moment. And it was a part of God's plan for Travis's life. What happened to him was part of God's plan. It was inspired by God's love for him. Now here's the mysterious part about all of this. We don't understand how all of this fits together. We don't understand the whys and the wherefores. We would never wish a horrible experience like this on anyone, a frightening experience like this on anyone. But in the long run, wow, did it accomplish a lot in this young man's life. He grew by leaps and bounds through those days and weeks and months and years following that terrible accident. Now, here's the other point I want to make. All of us, every one of us, has crisis points in our lives. Notice I said points. There are various times that come suddenly and very unexpectedly sometimes in our lives that thrust us into this crisis mode. When was the last time you had one of those? What was the occasion? Was it an illness in your family? Was it an illness in you? Was it a surgery that you faced? Was it some sort of a relationship problem? What was it that created your crisis point? And inevitably, when we come to those points, we say, Lord, get me out of here quick. Change this right now. I can't take this. I don't want any part of this. And the Lord said, trust me in this. And he also says, I'm with you in this. But sometimes it's not his will to take us out of those situations. And that's what this passage is about. Hebrews chapter 12, verses 1 through 11, which was beautifully read for you today by Marie, is a passage that has always bothered me. It's a passage that has not set well with me, and I've never really fully understood it, and I'll be the first to admit that. And I kind of, when I was reading the book of Hebrews, I'd kind of skip past this part as fast as I could, because it talked about discipline. And in my mind, the minute I hear the word discipline, I hear maybe a father penalizing a child for doing something wrong. Isn't that what you think about? Discipline? Penalties inflicted on someone for doing something wrong. Lovingly, yes, but that's kind of what discipline rings true in our head. That's what we think about. And I kept reading about God slapping our hands here, and that's how I read it when I first came to this passage. God disciplines us, slaps our hands whenever we do something wrong, and maybe occasionally there's a big wrong in our lives and we get a big crisis out of it, and we just have to sit and think, well, what did I really do here to bring this on? And again, it never sat very well with me until I really got to studying this word. The word in Greek, paideo, is a very interesting word. It means to train. It means to educate, to train a child. It's the word that's used in instructing a child. Not so much in slapping their wrist when they do something wrong, but it's used to shape a child. And sometimes, according to this word, sometimes it involves letting a child experience something that may be a little tough on them, a little painful. We do that knowing there may be a broken heart in it for them, but also we do that because we know that that's what life is like. And as a parent, we sometimes allow our kids to go through those things because we know that on the other side they'll be stronger. They'll be better prepared for the days that are ahead. They'll be more in touch with their own feelings, more sympathetic. It will mature them. It'll grow them. Going through those potentially crisis points and tough times in our lives. Well, that's what this passage is all about. It's about a loving God who knows us, and he also knows the world that we live in. He knows the terribly flawed world that we live in, and he knows that the world that we live in is full of crisis points. It's full of sorrows and heartaches and tough times. It's full of hurdles to jump across and challenges to face, races set before us. It's full of those kind of things. And God in his wisdom sometimes allows us to go through things that may not be what we choose. They may not be the most pleasant experiences in the world, but they are experiences that change us. They're crisis points in our lives. They change us forever. And they make us into the people that he ultimately desires. Now, the interesting thing about this passage is the first person that we run into in this passage to set the stage for all this talk about discipline is Jesus. Did Jesus need any discipline? No. He did not. He did not need a lick of discipline in the traditional sense of the word. That teaches us immediately that this discipline is not the slap on the wrist kind of discipline. It is the shaping kind of discipline. And it says, Jesus, look at Jesus. He's your perfect example. When it came to the last week in his life, he was thrust into this crisis point. He was betrayed by his friends. He was abandoned by his closest disciples. He was put through a kangaroo court. He was put on trial, and then he was taken out and beaten. And ultimately, he was taken to Calvary, and he was crucified. And the writer of Hebrews says, now look, Jesus is the example here. God let him go through these incredibly intense crisis points in his life. And as a result of that, he's the perfecter of our faith. He can say, I've been there. In anything you potentially will face in this world, I have been there. He's the pioneer of enduring the crisis. And ultimately, of course, at the other end, he triumphed. And now he says, I don't want you to disregard the discipline or the training that is coming to each of you. Remember, Jesus passed this same way, and now the Father who loves you is going to expose you to some crises in your life that will definitely change you and shape you and make you a person who reaches out to the Father and says, please help me, save me, makes me more dependent on him. He is going to change me as a result of all that I experience. He is going to change me from the inside out into the kind of person that is like Jesus. Now, the irony in all of this, when we read about this as parents, instinctively, as parents, we're trying to say, look, I don't want my kids going through tough times. I'm going to do everything in my power, Instinctively, I'm going to do everything in my power to prevent those tough times from coming to my kids. I'm going to try to avoid them. I'm going to refuse them when they come along. I'm going to insulate them from as many struggles in this life as I possibly can. From all the pain that I can take away from their lives, I'm going to do it as a parent. And yet, this word comes back to the fore. It is a word that God exercises. Paideo. And it's translated raising a child, training a child, instructing a child by letting them experience life. It's really about letting beloved children encounter all of life, even with its unkindnesses and struggles and sufferings. It's not punishment for things done wrong. It is instead done out of love. And as parents, when we see our kids going through those kind of things, we stand by them, we help them, we counsel them, we love them, we provide as much as possible a safety net underneath them, a support network for them, a listening ear for them when they go through those kind of struggles. That's the kind of treatment we get from God. And he reminds us again and again that that's the way he relates to us. He'll be there in those deepest, darkest struggles. And you know, as I thought about this and as I studied this mystery this week, the person that came to mind finally about 3/4 of the way through the week, you know who it was? David. David had an incredible amount of crisis points in his life. He's out there as a shepherd in the wilderness, trying to keep track of his father's flock of sheep, and he's fending off wild animals at the risk of his own life. And then along comes the call to go and face the giant Goliath. Next crisis point. And he's standing before Goliath with just a slingshot in his hand, and here's this giant with all of his armor. Next thing you know, he's anointed the king, and Saul is jealous to the point of wanting to kill him and chasing him all over the countryside, and David is forced to hide out from this madman